Good evening. My name is Lucia Wilkes-Smith, and I am hosting this event this evening on behalf of Women Against Military Madness and the Middle East Committee of WAM. So welcome to all of you who are joining us this evening. And I would like to open this gathering. Even though we're in many different places, we probably all can participate in the land acknowledgement. And so, Bdote is a Dakota word that generally means where two waters come together. The Bdote where Hahatanka, river of the waterfall, or Wakpatanka, big river, called the Mississippi River in English, and the Minnesota Wakpa, or Minnesota River, come together is central to Dakota spirituality and history. Bdote is a place that carries a complicated and layered history. In the thousands of years the Dakota people have been in relationship and kinship with the land here. And in the several hundred years since European settlers colonized the land that the state of Minnesota now occupies. The United States land seizures were a project of spiritual destruction that denied the Dakota free and unhindered access to the land that fundamentally shapes their identity and spirituality. Today, 11 reservations are located within the borders of Minnesota, 4 Dakota communities in the southern portion of the state, and 7 Ojibwe communities in the north. WAM pays tribute to the Dakota and Ojibwe. We invite you, as audience members, to consider the land on which you live and the confluence of legacies that bring you to stand where you are, primarily through critical reflection and conversation within your own community. This land acknowledgement can be found on the WAM website if you would like to use it in other settings. So welcome again to the this event sponsored by the Middle East Committee of Women Against Military Madness. The Middle East Committee is one of several WAM groups that focus on issues or hotspots. Middle East Committee sponsors educational speakers and films, protest demonstrations and vigils, and other events. The group meets for planning on the second Monday of each month. So do check the WAM website for details about the Middle East Committee and about each of WAM's activist committees. And you're welcome to participate in any and all of them. Today's session, we've entitled The Role of Palestine in US Elections. That seems kind of strange, but we realize, as the description of this event has said, enormous amounts of money pour into the various political campaigns around the United States with the apparent goal of influencing elections and manipulating governance throughout the nation. Such pressures have occurred in past election cycles. This time, Minnesota's 5th Congressional District is a blatant example of extreme financial investment from outside the district. Join this evening in discussion of the possible hows and whys behind such activity that we're experiencing now. I'm going to ask our 4 panelists to introduce themselves. First, before we do that, I want to remind you that WAM, Women Against Military Madness, is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that works to educate and activate our communities. We encourage everyone to vote. However, no political candidate will be endorsed nor opposed by WAM. No specific political party is endorsed nor opposed. The purpose of today's program is to raise awareness and questions about campaign financing and the political pressures we all should be observing. So with that introduction, and I also want to let you know, audience, as you may have questions for our speakers, if you're on Zoom, you may put those into the chat. And if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you may just type those into those various fora, and we will receive and sort through the questions and ask them of the speakers. So thank you very much for your patience in this extended opening. And now I would ask each of the speakers to introduce yourselves. Maybe first, Sana. Okay. Whoop, you're muted, Sana. Okay, Sana.
Hello, Sana, and I am originally from Louisiana and studied at Southern University in Baton Rouge. And I mentioned that because I was very much involved in the civil rights movement and various activities while I was a student at Southern in Baton Rouge. In terms of my background is an educator. I've been an educator for, I would say at least 40 years. I am semi-retired. I do some work off and on at Metropolitan State University here in St. Paul. As an educator, a lot of my work has been within the US and also working abroad. I spent time for a number of years working in Kuwait University. And it was while living and working in Kuwait that I became engaged in the Palestinian story. I had a number of very close Palestinian friends whose families had been living in Kuwait since the early 50s. And so I got to know a lot about the Palestinian story from Palestinians who were basically refugees in Kuwait. My engagement in Palestinian solidarity work has also been for more than 30 years. And I worked with various organizations in New Orleans, specifically the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. And here in Minnesota, some of the first organizing that we did in terms of Palestine was actually at the university. Sorry about
that. Thank you. Sana.
I'm so sorry.
Sana, let's go over to...
Okay. Can I finish?
Okay, finish up and then we'll have Manar introduce herself.
All right. And so the work that I've done, I was going to mention that the work that I did, my engagement here in Minnesota with the Palestinian solidarity work was, I was part of the Students for Justice in Palestine organization, which started at the University of Minnesota. And this was the late 90s, early 2000s. And we had a delegation from Minnesota, about 7 of us, who attended the very first Students for Justice in Palestine conference in 2002 at University of California, Berkeley. And over the years, I've worked with various organizations. I've traveled to Palestine a number of times. And my last time was in 2015, where I taught at An-Najah University in Nablus.
Thank you, Sana.
I've also done some publishing on Palestine too.
Yes, thank you very much. And Manar, please.
Hello, this is Manar Mahawish. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News. I've been a journalist for over 10 years now, and Mint Press News very specifically covers how special interest groups, including the Israeli lobby, influence policies right here at home and abroad. And I am actually Palestinian American, and although I was born and raised here in the United States, when I was a teenager, or I guess a preteen, my parents moved us to live in Palestine so that we can learn about our culture and heritage. And that was really the first time that I witnessed war crimes and human rights abuses at the age of 9 years old. And I lived there for about 4 years and experienced a lot of trauma living under Israeli occupation and apartheid. I witnessed, children being shot at, being denied an education, being brought back from checkpoints. And I watched, warplanes dropping bombs on homes. And I witnessed the apartheid wall being built, in communities, water being cut off. And so Palestine has, made a very special place in my heart, and was basically the inspiring point to start Mint Press and, make it into the news organization that it is today. I also have a history or a background, in, podcast producing and producing video and TV shows on Free Speech TV.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rafael, would you go next? I think I've unmuted. You're unmuted. Okay, good.
Hi, my name is Rafael Zalinski, and I'm a recent graduate of North Park University in Chicago, where I majored in philosophy, and I spent a semester studying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then spent time abroad in Palestine and Israel learning from peace and human rights activists. And additionally, I studied abroad in South Africa, where we learned about the history and effects of apartheid. And I've taken courses on ethics, justice and human rights, as well as post-colonial literature. I'm a new member of Jewish Voice for Peace, Twin Cities, an organization which works to end racism, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, and anti-Arab bigotry and all forms of oppression. And we seek an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestine and peace and justice for all people in the Middle East.
Thank you, Rafael. And Tarek.
Tarek.
Go ahead
Hi.
and introduce yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Tarek Khalil. I am an attorney, activist, and also a board member of the Chicago chapter of the American Muslims for Palestine, and I'm also the education coordinator for the American Muslims for Palestine, AMP. The purpose of AMP is to essentially educate the public on the deep history of Palestine, its rich cultural roots, and also highlighting very vividly Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity vis-a-vis the Palestinians throughout all of historic Palestine and Palestinians in the diaspora as well. So that's really our mission, and we try to do the best that we can to educate the public, and we do see that there's been a shift in public opinion recently. Not as much as we would like, but definitely a meaningful one that we need to emphasize, and we need to pick up from there and move it forward and bring about some real change. So I kept it brief.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would say let's plunge ahead with our questions. As I had said earlier, the WAM Middle East Committee members came up with some questions, and we did want to ask Sana to start us off. And the question has to do with, well, first of all, tell us a bit about the United States aid to Israel, financial aid, and in our own country, what is the history? Because I know you've done some research and writing about history of right-wing and pro-Israel lobbies in the United States that have silenced and ousted politicians who have both voiced their concerns about U.S. aid to Israel. So, Sana.
Okay. In terms of, I guess when I think in terms of politicians who have been impacted, attacked by various Israel lobby organizations. In many cases, that is because they have been critical about the amount of aid and the kind of aid that the US has provided Israel. So I'd rather talk more specifically about politicians themselves and some of the various individuals who have certainly been impacted by attacks from the Israel lobby because of criticism. And so what I'd like to begin with is indicate that for anyone who has paid close attention over the decades at the extent to which especially prominent African Americans have been attacked as anti-Semitic because they dared to speak out and act on US foreign policy in relation to Israel, and also dared to speak out and act in solidarity with Palestinians. The early attacks in 2019 on Representative Omar and also Representative Rashida Tlaib, within weeks of them having been sworn in as members of Congress, were hardly surprising. There has been a long history of US politicians being excoriated and losing elections because of either questioning US-Israel relations, and of course, that is often because of the kind of funding that the US has provided Israel, and also because many of these politicians have called for an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestine and for the self-determination and freedom for Palestinians. And so what I'd like to do is highlight who some of these politicians are. And in my highlighting these politicians, you'll see that in many cases, they were questioning not only the relationship, but the kind of aid, the kind of funding that the US over the years has provided to Israel. However, I also think it's important to detail how the false accusations of anti-Semitism targeting Ilhan Omar are found within an African-American historical narrative. Omar, for me, is the representation of a legacy which has led to job terminations, challenges to political office, cancellation of invitations, backlash, and condemnation, because she is an African American, has dared to speak out and/or act on US-Israeli policies and also on Palestinian human rights. And so let me just kind of begin with some of the early politicians who faced attacks and who actually lost elections because the Israel lobby promoted challenges and funded challenges to their campaigns. One of the very early persons back in the late 70s was Adlai Stevenson III, who was the son of the Democratic candidate for president against Dwight Eisenhower. His father was the candidate for president. Stevenson believed his defeat twice for governor of Illinois was because of his positions on Israel while he was a senator. He had sharp differences with the Israeli lobby on issues concerning the Mideast, including a 1979 vote to cut military assistance to Israel. Also, he had met with PLO leader Yasser Arafat, and that, of course, rankled the senator's pro-Israel critics. Another politician who had a record of criticizing US-Israeli policy was Paul Finley, also from Illinois, a Republican. And he was a Republican rep from 1960 to 1982, and he drew attention for his criticism of American policy on Palestine, which he believed caused him to lose his seat to Dick Durbin, who is, of course, still in Congress today. and Durban received the backing of many pro-Israel groups. Another individual who received backing and support, at least I should say attacks, because of his stand against the US-Israel relations, was Charles Percy, who was also an Illinois politician, and he was a popular senator. And at one time, he was considered the Republicans' answer to JFK. And he was defeated in his bid for a fourth term as senator by the Democrat Paul Simon in 1984, who was supported by the pro-Israel lobby. And the lobby poured huge sums of money into his coffers. And of course, Percy lost. And he had criticized Israel for missing opportunities to negotiate with Palestinians. He had described Arafat as a relative moderate, and he had twice voted for controversial sales of US arms to Saudi Arabia, which were opposed by both Israel and AIPAC. I'd like to really bring your attention to two African Americans. And when I looked back at these African Americans and I looked at what was happening to Ilhan Omar, right away I said, okay, we've seen this before. Back in in 1993, Earl Hilliard, who was the first African American representing Alabama in Congress since Reconstruction, had served up until 2002 4 terms, and he was defeated by Arthur Davis, an African American federal prosecutor who challenged Hilliard a second time, receiving huge sums of money from pro-Israel groups from all over the US. And Hilliard's fatal error was calling for some measure of even-handedness in the Middle East. And he also voted against a bill funding increases in military support to Israel and opposing criminalization of Palestinian politicians. At the same time Hilliard was being attacked, so was Cynthia McKinney, the first African-American woman to represent Georgia. And she and Hilliard came to Congress at the same time, obviously coming from two deep South states. And in 2002, in her 4th term, she found herself in a tight Democratic primary against a newcomer to electoral politics. And McKinney's outspokenness in calling for real debate on the Middle East provoked backlash from pro-Israel groups who sought to defeat her by backing an African-American challenger. Sounds familiar. Once again, huge financial support from these pro-Israel groups was one of the major factors leading to her defeat. One of the things, however, is that Cynthia McKinney was able to return to Congress after a term. So I just kind of mentioned these. There's some others, situations that I can talk about later, but this just this gives you an idea, gives you some sense of how the lobby the pro-Israel lobby has always, whenever a politician, especially a congressperson, does attack US-Israel relationships, does question the amount of funding that the US provides Israel. When a politician does show support, call for fairness in the treatment of Palestinians, what we've often seen is that these politicians are attacked. We have a slightly different situation here in Minnesota, and if I have more time, I'd really like to talk about that. Can I continue?
Thank you. Yeah, well, let's loop back to you. I know, Sana, that you have written you have recently, articles have been published that you have written, and I think they've been published in the Spokesman Recorder.
And Manda Weiss, yeah.
And where else?
Manda Weiss.
Manda Weiss, correct. Yes, yes. So people should go to those two sources to review and gather additional information about what you've just briefly told us. Does anyone else of our panel have something to add to what Sana has said? Just give a little wave. And if not, we can come back to that later, and we can go on to our second question, which I believe, because I think we occasionally change the numbering, but it's about anti-Semitism. And certainly many of us have been criticized or called anti-Semitic when we spoke out about Israeli government policies and actions, or about U.S. funding of Israel and the U.S. pro-Israeli lobbies. So who would like to address that specific topic? One of you? Yes, Rafael, I can unmute you. I didn't.
Thank you.
Okay.
And yeah, I just wanted to say, as someone who's grown up in a Jewish home and all my family is Jewish, and I frequently come across this, even myself being called anti-Semitic, being Jewish and being called anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel and criticizing the pro-Israeli lobbies. But I just want to say that the Jewish people and Judaism in general, it's not a monolith. And the Israeli government is certainly not an authority on Judaism or the Jewish people. And the same goes for the pro-Israeli lobbies, that they do not represent all or even a majority of American Jews. So I just wanted to make that statement, because especially as a Jewish Voice for Peace, we don't agree with the Israeli government or the pro-Israeli lobbies. So I just wanted to make that statement, and then pass it off to anyone else who wants to make statements on it.
Anyone else want to comment? Am I there? Whoops. You can hear me, but you can't see me, perhaps. Oh, did you want to add something?
Yes, sure. Whoa. I sort of echoed there when I first started. Okay. The interesting thing about that label is that it's not really founded on any connection to the denotation of the word itself. It's really connected to how it's perceived and how the mainstream perceives it. So when you criticize Israel in one sense, it's not anti-Semitic. So for instance, if you say, the government structure is a little bit off and the coalition government is wrong, it should be, the structure of the government should change. Okay, well, that's a critique that's not really anti-Semitic. But if you criticize the Zionist nature of the state, and you criticize the inhumanity that really paved the way for the creation of the state itself, and the injustice that's imposed on the Palestinian people, it's that critique that's considered anti-Semitic and labeled as such. And that is why when congresspersons such as Ilhan Omar or AOC or Rashida Tlaib, the squad, they call them, when they criticize Israeli policy in that context, of course that would be labeled anti-Semitic, because now you're targeting the very essence of the nature of the state itself, which is meant to preserve a Jewish majority, and it's meant to grab as much land as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. So any kind of critique against Israel in that context, where you're targeting those aspects of it, that would definitely be characterized as anti-Semitic. And I always refer to three basic elements that really define and make up Zionism, if we want to put it in very simple terms. It's essentially based on the notion that Palestine must be reconstituted as a state that is comprised mainly or solely for the Jewish people, but because that land was married to another people, the only way that you can achieve that is through dispossession. So one of the core elements is the dispossession of the indigenous Palestinians. The other core element is the ingathering of the Jewish exiles. So kick those that are living there out, bring those that are from out in. The only way you can do that is by the conquest of land. So these three elements kind of woven in together is what essentially, is the basis of Zionism. So any critique that targets those elements would be characterized as anti-Semitic.
Sana, can you go ahead? Okay, go ahead, Sana.
I certainly agree with Tariq. I wanted to kind of bring in something that, as I was talking about politicians, and I do believe there's an element of race involved in this aspect of who's called anti-Semitic. I think all of us know that our Congresswoman, Betty McCollum, has been very effective in criticizing Israeli policy and in proposing legislation and taking stands. In fact, she has come out primarily in support what she did was she was one of only 17 congresspersons who voted against a resolution opposing the BDS movement. But if we kind of go back to 2006, when she was a part of a small minority in Congress who criticized Israeli policy by voting against a Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act, many of us will remember that an AIPAC individual visited her office and indicated to her staff that Betty McCollum supported terrorists. And Betty McCollum wrote a very public letter to AIPAC indicating that the behavior of this representative was most insulting. And she said, I don't want AIPAC visiting my office until I have received an apology from AIPAC, which we are not sure she ever did, but they do not visit. And then, of course, when we think about the legislation that Betty McCollum has written over the last two terms, the previous term, she has legislation that she has presented that would prohibit the use of US military funding by Israel to detain Palestinian children living under the military occupation. I don't think we have heard the kind of attacks against Betty McCollum as being anti-Semitic as we heard against Ilhan Omar in false accusations of her being anti-Semitic or her statements being anti-Semitic. And I'd like to hear what others have to say, but I can think of other people of color, African Americans especially, who have taken a stand. I think of Mark Lamont Hill when he spoke at the United Nations, and he talked in terms of freedom for Palestinians, and he said, from the river to the sea. He was accused of being anti-Semitic. When Angela Davis was chosen by the Birmingham, I think, Human Rights Institute to receive an award, then all of a sudden, various kinds of attacks were levied against her. So my question is, who gets to be called anti-Semitic? And so maybe others would like to respond.
Yeah. Others, Minar, yes, we'll unmute you, and yes, whoops. What, maybe you did it.
Unmuted.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what everybody has said so far. And I just want to make a point that Israel is the largest purveyor of anti-Semitism in the world, and also the largest purveyor of Islamophobia around the world. You know, when I was, just going off of what Tarek had mentioned, when I was in junior high, when I had just arrived back from Palestine, I would talk to my peers about what I experienced in Palestine. And there was a student there that accused me of being anti-Semitic because I was describing apartheid and occupation and human rights abuses that I had witnessed and experienced. And I was so traumatized from my experience that the only way to heal from my trauma was to share these experiences. And then the more I did, the more I was accused of being anti-Semitic, although I myself was Semitic and I was Palestinian. And so if you look at the mainstream media today, we have pro-Israel groups that are obviously smearing any opponent and dissenting voice that criticizes Israeli occupation and apartheid and human rights abuses, like Ilhan Omar, like other candidates like Betty McCollum and Cynthia McKinney and Rashida Tlaib and, you know, the Squad and so forth. And even people, and they put so much pressure on these candidates to apologize for pointing out these human rights abuses and for pointing out the Israel lobby's influence on American politics. And, you know, if you look at what Israel is doing, all this is obviously an ad hominem attack to silence dissent. And, you know, we just have to make sure that that's very clear that it's an ad hominem attack. But with Israel's policies and its actions taking place within the US government, not only is it, you know, using this as an ad hominem attack, but it's also influencing US politics and policies around the world to increase anti-Semitism against Jews and also against Muslims too, whether it's from Israel's very direct arming of literally neo-Nazis, the Azov battalion in the Ukraine. I mean, how many times we read reports of Israel arming literal neo-Nazis across Europe, and the most famous one is that of the Ukraine. And I mean, I thought that, you know, Israel was founded on the premise of, you know, protecting Jews against